委内瑞拉跟中国的合作关系可以追溯到10多年之前。最近，委内瑞拉混乱的政治形势，相持不下的两位领导人相继对中国示好，让外界不住猜测中国政府到底要站哪边，到底对委内瑞拉要采取什么样的政策。今天我们请来了波士顿大学全球发展政策中心的学者 Rebecca Ray。Rebecca 是中国对拉美投资和基础设施建设方面的专家。在我们的对话里 ，Rebecca 提到，中国和俄罗斯、委内瑞拉的两个借贷大国对委内瑞拉新领导人的反应截然不同。中国大多数时候都保持了沉默，或者说中立，既没有撤回对马杜罗政权的承认，又没有倡导其他国家保持站队马杜罗。最终来说，中国在委内瑞拉的发展形势下采取的是一个非常中立的态度。他认为，中国希望通过这种表态，无论以后谁上台，都能保持很好的经济合作关系。如果瓜伊多上台了，很有可能的就是委内瑞拉在借款和接受投资上有了更多的可能，所以他们不会完全依赖中国，这可能会让委内瑞拉有一个更加平衡的经济模式。至于美国对委内瑞拉国有石油企业制裁是对中国石油进口有影响的，因为许多炼油厂受到牵连被禁止了。但是委内瑞拉又承诺会通过没有受到制裁的炼油厂争取向中国出口相同量的石油。Rebecca 认为，拉丁美洲国家里发展的相对平衡的友国是厄瓜多尔。厄瓜多尔开拓了国际市场，维系着跟中国的关系，但是又不完全依赖中国。他认为这种模式是更加健康的。而相比之下，委内瑞拉只有中国和俄罗斯两个大盟友。他还认为，中国在拉美国家的基础设施建设上是可以达到双赢的。国际社会上对中国的拉美投资有许多争议，可能是因为没有争议的项目都不太可能上到新闻。比方说，中国在厄瓜多尔的风力资源项目，因为比较成功，都没有报道。而且他认为要意识到的很重要的一点是，这些项目很多是拉美国家自发提出的，所以最终都是要本国承担起建设的责任。因此，盲目责备中国是不合适的，毕竟中国有出资进行建设。下面，请听我和 Rebecca 的完整对话。
So the first thing I would like to ask is about the long-standing relationship between China and many Latin American countries, especially Venezuela. So I believe the relationship between Venezuela and China dates back to over a decade ago. So I was wondering if you could walk us through how Latin America, especially Venezuela, why is it close to China?
Of course.During the last decade, China found itself in a period of extraordinary economic growth, which was accompanied by an extraordinary need for raw materials, more than its current suppliers were able to give it. And during that same time, many Latin American governments, especially Venezuela, but also Ecuador and Bolivia, began to pursue unorthodox economic policies, which meant that Western investors left those countries. These two circumstances were perfectly matched for each other, and China was able to begin expanding its network of providers of raw materials to include these countries where Western investors had left, essentially leaving the field open for new investors from China. Ideologically, this was a good match because both partners were willing to work with non-capitalist or mixed economic systems. So this was a win-win scenario for much of Latin America and China for many years in this period.
And
it was just a perfect match between the needs of China and the needs of these Latin American countries. At the same time, it's important to point out that many of the countries in Latin America that were part of this relationship were enacting legislation regulating raw materials sectors, such as labor regulations, environment regulations, indigenous rights, that scared off Western investors Chinese investors, our research has shown that Chinese investors were willing to stay, even though the short-term costs of doing business were hurt because it's a little more expensive to do business in a way that's environmentally friendly or that respects the rights of indigenous communities. They were willing to stay, and that made them a perfect partner for these countries that were trying to expand their regulatory oversight mechanisms in these very controversial sectors that have always been the source of conflict in these countries.
Mm-hmm. Is that a case as well for China and Venezuela?
Yes, absolutely. So Venezuela, like other minerals producers in Latin America, changed the taxation and royalties process and nationalized part of its raw materials sector. This led to Western investors and Western importers fleeing, but China was willing to continue its relationship. And in fact, when no one else was willing to lend the government money to continue oil producing or to expand into new oil deposits and now gold deposits as well more recently, China was willing to do that. It has a greater appetite for taking on political risk because state-owned enterprises don't need to make quarterly profits goals. They can take this risk in the short term because the oil will still be there and the gold will still be there. So they can ride out that storm in a way that Western private investors can't because they have to show profits in the short term.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a sense of how big the money flow between these two countries?
Well, it's unfortunately very difficult to trace the flow of oil from Venezuela to China because it uses intermediate countries where the refineries are that have specializations in refining the very heavy crude that is produced in Venezuela. But we do know that those intermediary refineries have been impacted by the U.S. sanctions against PDVSA, against the national oil company in Venezuela. This means that it will, in fact, impact Venezuela's ability to continue shipping China the same amount of oil that it has been shipping, sometimes to repay debt. But Venezuela has said that it will be sending its oil to other refineries that will not pay it as much money because they have to work to refine that particular kind of oil. So this will mean Venezuela will be slower in meeting its obligations to China, but in the past few years, China has shown itself to be a very patient creditor with Venezuela, and it's still supporting Maduro. If it wanted to be repaid particularly quickly in the short term, it could join Western countries in recognizing Guaido and perhaps be repaid more quickly. But it has a long-term perspective. China has always had a long-term perspective with Venezuela. We don't see a repetition of, for example, China's infamous now incident with Sri Lanka, where lending for a port deal went bad and China took possession of the port. We don't see a parallel like this. Instead, you see Venezuela being very patient with Venezuela. And so, yes, this will impact the flow of oil from Venezuela to China. And this is to repay, by the way, about $5 billion of credit. So significant, mainly not because of its size, but because of the fact that other lenders are not present. And so Venezuela's relationship with China is not because China is lending huge amounts of money, but rather because nobody else is lending that money. There's China and there's Russia, and that's about it.
You briefly mentioned that even though there is this U.S. sanctions against oil from Venezuela and that it has some sort of negative inferences on the export to China already, do you see how the Chinese government is responding to this?
Yes, I think it's very interesting how the Chinese government is responding to the situation in Venezuela. When we think about countries that have been lending money to the Maduro regime in Venezuela, there's China and there's Russia. Russia has been vocally trying to push Western countries to rescind their recognition of Guaido and to recognize Maduro instead. China, on the other hand, has been mostly quiet expressing its willingness to, it hasn't removed recognition from Maduro, but nor has it pushed anyone else to maintain their recognition for Maduro. Instead, China is largely pursuing a strategy of non-intervention, of working with whoever is in charge at the moment. And if Maduro resigns, it's likely that China will continue working with the Venezuelan government because Guaido has reached out to China and received, it has given reassurance that Venezuela will honor its relationship with China, and he claims to have received assurance in return that China will continue to work with Venezuela. So, yes, China is continuing to recognize Maduro, but no, it is not actively pushing anyone else to do that, and it's not trying to alter or push the discussion in one direction or the other. Instead, it's being a mostly passive creditor right now, very patient, like I've said before.
And if Guaido eventually comes to power, what do you think these two countries' relationship is going to head it to?
Well, if Guaido eventually comes to power, Venezuela will have other options for creditors and for investors. Guaido has said he will consider opening the national oil company to foreign investors, and I'm sure, given the fact that Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves, I'm sure foreign investors will be interested in coming. And so if Guaido takes over, then I believe that Venezuela will have other options. But so they may be borrowing more and receiving investment more from other countries, but that doesn't mean that they won't honor their obligations to China. Guaido has given reassurance that he will, in fact, honor those obligations. But they won't be completely dependent on China moving forward. China and Russia, I should say.
Some commentators would say that no matter which leader is in power, it doesn't really affect the relationship between these two countries because eventually China needs oil and Venezuela can provide oil. I was wondering what you think of this opinion.
Oh, sure. Well, we have to remember there's three avenues through which China has been involved in Venezuela. There's finance, there's investment. So finance is outright lending to the government or to the oil company, the national oil company. There's investment through Chinese investors in Venezuela, and there's trade. They're always going to need to import oil from Venezuela. That's not going to go away. Even if they don't necessarily continue to extend as much finance in the future, they may or may not. I don't know, but Guaido will be able to receive financing from other sources. So if he emerges as the president of Venezuela, I imagine there'll be a more balanced portfolio of debt that they have from different sources. But of course, China will continue to want to import the oil itself. Now, if PDVSA, the national oil company, is opened up to foreign investors, I'm sure there'll be an international tendering process, but Chinese oil companies are well positioned to play a part in that because they've been active in the region for so long. And so hopefully, whatever government moves forward, if PDVSA is open to private investors, hopefully Chinese companies as well as Western companies will be considered.
And Rebecca, you are an expert in China's infrastructure building in Latin America, and I was wondering what do you see are some of the recent developments of China in Latin America, especially Venezuela? Well, the region desperately needs more infrastructure. This is true in oil countries such as Venezuela, but it's also true in non-oil countries, especially countries that are bordering the Amazon basin or have the Amazon basin in their country, like Venezuela and the other Andean countries that form the edges of the Amazon basin. So we see China's willingness to invest and lend for transportation infrastructure into and out of the Amazon. Traditionally, Washington, D.C.-based multilateral development banks would finance this kind of infrastructure, but certain kinds of infrastructure, especially in the Amazon itself, are too risky for Washington, D.C.-based multilaterals because they have environmental rules, they have social safeguards. China largely defers to
the borrowing government on all of those things. And so the presence of China, the arrival of China as a partner, allows countries to finance infrastructure projects that would be too risky for Washington, D.C.-based multilaterals to finance. And so we've seen over the last several years a proliferation of infrastructure projects deeper and deeper into the Amazon basin from periphery countries such as Venezuela. The most recent project of Venezuela, of course, is a rail project that seems to have stalled out, which makes sense given the government chaos in Venezuela. If Guaido takes over, I would not be surprised if the rail project begins again as things return to stability. We'll have to wait and see.
Do you see this infrastructure building as beneficial to both, or are some of them leaving negative effects? Yeah. Go ahead.
Infrastructure can be a win-win, and in many cases it is, but those aren't the projects that make the news. So, for example, China financed a small wind project in the south of Ecuador. It's the first major wind project in Ecuador. It's the highest elevation wind project in the world. It makes no news because it isn't problematic. There haven't been concerns that it's not an environmental problem. There aren't social problems. Unfortunately, the infrastructure projects that make the news are always the ones with major controversies associated with them. And that's, unfortunately, we see evidence that Latin American governments are approaching China with projects that Western banks won't touch because they have negative sides to them. And China may be signing up to finance projects that have risks that China doesn't know about. And so we advocate for more due diligence up front so that China doesn't find itself in high-risk projects that it can't get out of easily without major international embarrassment. There is, any infrastructure going into the Amazon is going to have social and environmental consequences. But it's important to recognize that the Latin American governments themselves are the ones pushing these projects. And so ultimately responsibility lies on the shoulders of the national governments who are pushing these projects. And when traditional lenders won't finance them, they turn to China. And so it is not appropriate to act like China is pushing these projects, but they may not happen without Chinese finance because China has more appetite for risk.
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, there are observations that it's expanding into Latin American countries. So do you think eventually Venezuela would be included in this project?
It really depends on the political circumstances in Venezuela right now. If Maduro remains in power, then yes, I would imagine so. But the truth is the Belt and Road Initiative is not just about Chinese finance, right? Not all of the finance for Belt and Road Initiative projects is going to come from China. But you have to have, it would be unlikely for a country to be in the Belt and Road Initiative if they didn't have good relationships with Beijing. And so I'm sure if Maduro stays in power, it would not surprise anyone for them to join the Belt and Road Initiative. Right now, they have so many domestic concerns, they're not really worried about that. But yes, moving into the future, I would expect so. If Guaido comes into power, or if, as he says, he'll be an interim president for 1 year and then a new president will be elected, we'll have to wait and see, but I think right now it might be too politically sensitive.
And I'm sure actually a lot of the observers in the international communities are actually worried about being included in this project because of how they are observing the relationship between China and Venezuela, because Venezuela is so heavily in debt. So what do you think are some of the things that Latin American countries can learn from their observations on this China-Venezuela relationship?
Well, I think a better example would actually be Ecuador, because while Ecuador has always borrowed heavily from China, now that it has access to international markets, which it did not for several years, it continues to borrow from China, but also borrows from Western sources and also borrows from multilateral sources. And so China is an important partner to Ecuador, but so are Western bond markets, and so are the multilateral development banks. That kind of balanced portfolio is more sustainable financially over time. And I think as Venezuela moves forward, and we realize that it has two major creditor allies, China and Russia, a more balanced portfolio of debt is always preferable. And of course, I believe Venezuela would have one if it had political relationships with other creditors. The reason why China is there, again, is because others are not. So where countries have the freedom to have balanced portfolios of relationships with a lot of different countries, they tend to pursue those opportunities and have that kind of balanced portfolio like Ecuador has. The Venezuela approach tends to happen when there are not avenues to Western lenders of various types. And so there isn't really a lesson to be learned because I think it's already been learned by the other countries in the region. The other countries in the region pursue balanced portfolios when they can. They pursue diversification of export markets and diversification of investors in their country when they can. And where you see China being the only major partner is often because there are no other options for that country.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but would you say the current relationship between China and Venezuela is unsustainable and not balanced?
Well, unsustainable is a hard word to define. China is able to continue this relationship, and Venezuela seems able to continue the relationship, although their repayment schedule for their debts will have to continue to be renegotiated, as it has been in the last few years. And so I don't see that as unsustainable. It can continue as it is. However, so many other things in that country are not sustainable right now, that the relationship with China will be impacted by those things. We will have to wait and see how the China-Venezuela relationship is impacted by the transition of power. There are new legislative elections that have been scheduled. I think China will just remain outside and neutral to all of these processes and will work with whoever emerges as the new leader of Venezuela. That's my expectation, and so I see no reason why it will be unsustainable.
Okay. So my last question is, where do you think Venezuela is heading amid this massive political turmoil, and do you see China playing a role in its future?
I'm sure China will play a role in its future. I think China is trying to avoid playing a role in the turmoil. And so I think China is hoping that it can be neutral in this situation and then work with whoever is in charge in the future. I don't think the political situation is sustainable. It's currently chaotic. It will be difficult for either side to establish legitimacy at this point because the country is so extremely divided, as we saw this past weekend with multiple rallies for the different factions, and they were both enormous. Both sides have enormous support in their country. And so the situation is not sustainable, and right now either side claiming to represent the whole country does not have legitimacy for the whole country. And so once a government has legitimacy, however that happens, whether it's through new elections or a coalition government, however that happens, whatever kind of negotiated solution ends up happening, and let's all hope for a negotiated solution because that's the most peaceful approach. If there's a negotiated agreement, whoever then is able to lead with legitimacy, I'm sure China will be a partner. I don't see that changing, except that if Western investors are willing to come back to the country, then China will be one of many different partners that Venezuela has. If other Western investors do not come back to Venezuela, then China will continue to be one of two main external partners with Russia.